Canadian investors are using ZSP over any other ETF for exposure to the S&P 500 index. Institutional investors, investment advisors, and DIY investors have all been trusting ZSP with their investment dollars since the fall of 2012. ETFs provide instant access to a portfolio of stocks to an investor in a single, cost-efficient trade. For an investor to own the entire index would require institutional-level trading systems and expertise. To accomplish this, an investor would have to buy 500 stocks at a time, and then as the market moves, it would constantly have to rebalance those 500 stocks several times a year. ZSP simplifies this process by aiming to provide instant access to the 500 stocks in the index in a very easy and low-cost way. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keith into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble.
Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 150. The big 150, three amigos, Keith Dicker, IceCap Asset Management, Rich Diaz, IceCap Asset. What the hell? I'm the only one left.
2 down, 1 to go.
What's going on, Boomer?
Well, episode 150. So what's that? Twice my age? Yeah. Huh? Uh-oh. Loonie Hour math isn't working again on this
You're
one.
50, Keith? I thought you were older than that.
I said twice my age.
Oh.
Rich.
Loonie Hour math strikes again.
Rich, you're fired. You're canned, man. You're gone.
Yes, boss. Tell me.
Yeah, guys, last days of summer, just about. We have our most we get the shift in season down here around the college kids or university kids start showing up again. So that will happen next week. And I keep saying this every year. My favorite scene in Halifax in late August, early September is 2 dudes carrying a sofa, Chesterfield or a sofa down the road with a case of beer in the middle and stopping every block to have some drinks before continuing on with their sofa for their new flat.
You've been at the pool every day. Eh? Every time I talk to this guy on the phone, he's sitting by the pool at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I can swim like a fish. You should see me go, Rich. What's new with you, Rich?
Patrick Lene is what's new with me. It's been a really good week in Habs land. We fleeced the Columbus Blue Jackets on one of the best snipers. Otherwise, no, the dates, it's still a desert out there for me.
Patrick Lene is a liability.
He's not a liability. He's great. We're really excited in Habs land. It's a desert in Loveland, and it's been raining for 3 days straight. Otherwise, I'm working very, very hard, and I should be given a raise immediately. Other than that, that's basically it.
I'm pretty curious to see how that Lene trade develops. He was like a guy that had I think he was folding under the pressure of the Winnipeg market. Now he's going to Montreal, which is probably the hardest market to play in.
Yeah.
With some mental health issues, notably.
Yeah.
I mean, he will be playing
Don't
under
we all
Martin
have
St. Louis, so
yeah, great coach. Probably the best coach in the whole league, Martin St. Louis.
No bias at all.
No bias at all.
So being a bit unbiased for both of you turds there. I always laugh in sports. I was always, one team fleeced the other with the trade. And,
that's right.
You know, when there's a trade, both sides know information about the player they're trading away or draft picks or something. So, you know, don't get too excited there, young gun. Let's see how it plays out. I don't think anyone gets fleeced anymore.
Keith's a Halifax Mooseheads guy anyways.
That's right.
Yeah, they're
Keith,
fun. That's a fun evening.
Respectfully, Keith, I'm going to get very excited about this. We're going to win the cup. Sasonic Cup. I'm excited.
Oh, man, you sound like a Canucks fan. Brutal.
It's
our year.
Oh, dear. Okay, line us up, Steve. What are we doing today?
Yeah, we got episode 150. So we have our special guest, Mike Moffatt. We'll cue him up here shortly, but we've got Mike Moffatt. He's been doing, some outstanding tweets, threads on Twitter for immigration. He's been all over the immigration stuff, similar to our good pal of the show, Ben Rabideau. He's been dialing in housing starts. He's been sitting at the seat next to JT for some of these housing events, advising on policy. So, but he's been, let's give him this. He's been pretty balanced. You know, he'll call out when he sees mistakes, and yeah, so we're excited to have him on the show. We also
Whoa,
got
whoa, whoa! We can't have a balanced guest. We want to keep the echo chamber intact here. Let's cancel this one. This is not going to
cancel
work.
this one. Well, so we had some of the listeners giving some critique and feedback, so we'll have Mike Moffatt on. Canada CPI. We had the CN rail, CP rail as well. We got the big strike going on there. U.S. jobs. I think maybe we'll save that towards the end of the podcast after we discuss with Mike. But there's been some really interesting data coming out of the U.S. labor market. Huge revisions. So I think that's worth discussing because it really frames up everything.
Is Europe too? Europe is continues to, I don't know if hemorrhage is the right way to describe it, but certainly its manufacturing sectors just continues to do worse and worse. Especially
Did you see that protester, the nuclear protester?
My hero. He's my freaking hero. I love that guy.
What did he
I
do?
usually
He climbed. What did he climb the? You give the story.
Yeah, he climbed one of the steam towers. So giant cement tubes that Bart skates down. Well, in Germany, because they hate science and they hate the earth and whatever, however, their stupidity, but they've shut down on April 15th of 2023. They started shutting down their nuclear power plants. And this year, I guess, they're starting to blow them up, right? That's what you do when you sort of you decommission a power plant. Eventually, you have to like blow it up. And so this kid, or I guess, I don't know how old he is, but he like strapped himself to one of the tubes and he delayed it for about half an hour, apparently. So not as successful as I would have hoped.
He still blew it up.
Yeah, they still blew it up. Ridiculous.
Maybe they should turn it into a hotel or a theme park or, something like that. That would be
it's outrageous. It's outrageous that they shut down the nuclear power plants. These people hate everything.
But back to Rich's observation, we're starting, I think Rich tweeted it out this morning. We're starting to see more data to suggest that Germany, especially, as well as France, the economy continues to grind slower and slower, or lower and lower, whatever term you want to use. And, that continues with the expectation that we're seeing as well around the world. Everything is going down that path, and we will go into later with the employment conversation. But right now, I think now it's official. If it wasn't yesterday or tomorrow, but now the market is no longer focused on inflation, and is instead going to be focused on recession. So we're going to have this different, dynamic playing out. And we're starting to see, I mean, for us, we did a strategy change a few days back.
Drum roll.
Yeah, drum roll. But, we won't share it with everyone here, of course. But, it is in anticipation of the economy rolling a bit lower. As well, we're seeing some models now that we use. And the way models work in the investment world doesn't mean that the event is 100% going to happen. But we are seeing some models starting to suggest that, we could have just a market explosion in some worlds coming up in the near term. Now, explosion can be both good and bad, so don't try to interpret that as one thing or the other. And it's interesting because when we see it, and then I always like it when, somebody in my network, they'll reach out to me. It just happens at the same time. So this one guy that I'm friendly with, he's an Italian manager. He's based out of Milan. His name is Massimo, Rich. And if you ever go to, so what's cool about
Massimo?
But he if you ever gone to Milan, he's dressed like the high fashion guy from Milan, not like the gladiator. So
no, that's the thing about Italy. Everybody's dressed well. Everyone dresses well normally there. It's just amazing. We all dress like bums in North America.
Well, it's kind of funny, right? If Massimo is dressed extremely well and he's a handsome man. And then, you look at me, I'm wearing my Sasquatch t-shirt. So it's a bit odd. But he, out of the blue, he sent me a note as well and said, hey, Keith, they're starting to see, financial conditions deteriorate in other parts of the world as well. So we're seeing that there. You try to reconcile all the different trends and messages and what's noise and what isn't noise. And then you're able to, either put more risk on or take some off, and you play it that way. But it looks like, the sleepy summer hockey trade season is almost over, and we're going to get back to some good old rock and roll here in a couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the markets, slowing concerns around inflation. Canada CPI slowed to 2.5% year over year. The big part of that, again, mortgage interest costs still kind of, what's keeping it up. Mortgage interest costs still elevated at 21% year over year. So when you strip that out, if you just strip out mortgage interest costs, you've basically been hovering at 2% since January for Canada's CPI. And again, people will argue, baskets manipulated, inflation this, but I think from a market's perspective, I don't think it's a huge concern today. And I think that, Keith, would you argue solidifies the Bank of Canada rate cut in September?
So I'm looking at the Bank of Canada data here right now. Is it the
Drum roll.
For the drum roll, September 4th, which is coming up after the 3rd. We're pretty well guaranteed a rate cut coming up. So there's always one of us who takes the wrong side on the Twinkie bet. Rich.
Me, I bet they're gonna raise rates.
Really
two
for two Twinkies. Maybe Mike Moffatt really gonna come in here. And...
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But we're clearly right now the market is saying, we're going to have 25, maybe even 5 rate cuts over the next 5 meetings. That's what the market is suggesting here right now.
Well, I'd like to chime in on the CPI thing just to defend my position here for the the Twinkie.
Yeah, get it out.
One thing that supports your point of view, Steve, and now that I've got my data stream back, we can start really sharing charts on the Loonie Hour podcast. But we've always talked about this BOC preferred measures of core inflation, and now they are. So that's the factor model, the weighted mean approach, and the trimmed mean approach, and that strips out all this nonsense about mortgage interest costs. It deals with the shelter piece, and it sort of it does a really good job of getting the central tendency, which is the point really of trying to understand where inflation's going. And all of them are now below the upper end of the target. So the target's 2 plus or minus 1, and now it's 2.2, 2.4, and 2.7 respectively, and they're trending lower. I will just point out that you do have, so if we're like trying to be forward looking, I now call it the ice cap model. Keith, you like that? And there's a model I created, and that's basically based on PPI, so producer price indices, especially core producer price indices. So it excludes some of the variable stuff that we see like energy, etc. And that's already starting to move up, partly because of the weakness in the Loonie over the last little while, but that's starting to creep back higher, and so that usually leads core inflation by about 6 to 12 months. And so for all this talk of, that's why I think you should just be very careful before we we counter chickens and say they're going to cut by 5 and 6 times and whatever it is. There's still some inflationary pressures that are building up, and that's just natural, just the way the math sort of works.
Rich, but correct me if I'm wrong. Your model says ice caps inflation model by March 2025. So you're obviously modeling further out. You got CPI at 2.1. Is that right?
Yeah. Right, but if you so you're right. So that's a good point. So, but if you add that to the fact that services is still 4.4, right? Rental inflation, I know you don't like it, is still 8.5. We've still got, it is falling, shelters finally coming off. That's a really important one. I'm just saying, like, this idea that inflation is just going to come collapsing down and remain below 2, just like that. I mean, you've said it, I think, on this pod, and I agreed with you that 3 is the new 2. You know what I mean? I think we should all sort of get used to that.
Well, you know what? On shelter and rents and all that, well, that's why we got Mike on, Dr. Mike Moffatt. So I'm going to cue him up here now. This is a very long intro that Rich sent me this morning. So if you guys
read
have
the whole
5 minutes, hang tight, ready. I'm going to read the whole thing. Dr. Mike Moffatt is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute and an assistant professor in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy Group at Ivy Business School, Western University. Mike's research at SPI focuses on the intersection of regional economic development, building child-friendly, climate-friendly housing and communities, and clean innovation. In 2017, Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, advising deputy ministers on innovation policy and emerging trends. He also previously held the titles of Director Interim of the Lawrence National Center for Policy and Management, Director of Policy at Canada 2020, and the Chief Economist for the Moffatt Center at the University of Toronto. Mike has worked with politicians and policymakers of all political stripes in several countries to craft more effective public policy. From 2013 to 2015, Mike served as an economic advisor to Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. Mike holds a PhD in management science from Ivy Business School and an MA in economics from the University of Rochester. Outside of his clean economy work at SPI, Mike is a disability rights activist. Anyways, this is why we don't let Rich do most of the guest bios and intros. That was a word salad. But Mike's here. So let's, without further ado, let's bring Mike onto the Loonie Hour. Mike, welcome to Loonie Hour.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you on. Again, we've been huge fans of your Twitter feed there. So, Rich, I'm sure you got a whole bunch of questions lined up. So maybe I'll let you start this one out.
Yeah, so we just read your entire bio, and I apologize for that. But what is it exactly that you sort of do? I think that's often the best place to start, to frame up sort of what you do and why you're so passionate about it, and then we'll get into more maybe detailed questions a little bit later.
Yeah, no worries. I have this conversation with my parents all the time where they're like, well, what is it that you do for a living? So it's a couple of things. So first, I'm a prof at Ivy Business School in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy area group. And I'm also at the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is a think tank housed at the University of Ottawa. And to be honest, my background policy-wise is more in regional economic development, industrial policy, that kind of thing. And I've discovered over the last decade that housing is the thing that touches everything. To go back about 2016, 2017, we were doing some work with manufacturers in the GTA. Like companies that needed to be near Pearson Airport for supply chain reasons. And we were asking them, we were doing these roundtables around labor shortages. And the thing that we kept hearing over and over again is they kept saying, well, Mike, we can't find anybody who can work here because we can't find anybody who could afford to live here. And this was back in 2016. So over the last decade or so, housing, which had kind of been a side of desk kind of issue, for me, just kind of grew and grew and grew, because it really does touch everything. And now, I'm very sort of excited if I get to do something back in like manufacturing or supply chains, that kind of thing. But, at a high level, to me, like if we don't get housing right in this country, like nothing else works, right? We're going to lose the youth, but we're also, not going to be able to develop these industries and so on. If nobody can afford to live here, then nobody's going to be able to work in these really important middle class jobs.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I've got I get all these clients over the years and just these different conversations. I had one guy who was local dentist, and he was like, I'm having a hard time retaining my staff, like my I can't remember what they're called, forgive me, the people that clean teeth.
The hygienists.
Hygienists. I'm sure they make a decent income. And so he's like, I'm having a hard time retaining them. I actually want to buy several condos for them. I want to buy a couple condos and rent them out to my staff below market. So that way they know they have like long-term secured housing. And I was like, man, that's crazy. The fact that it's come to that. He was just saying he was having a lot of turnover and a lot of the feedback was just, unstable housing. And so, I mean, that kind of probably plays into a lot of the work that you do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's one of the things that kind of drives me a bit nuts is you'll hear people go, well, not everybody can live in Toronto or Vancouver or wherever. So why don't they just move? But the challenge is you need those middle class jobs to make these communities work, right? Like you can't have all the patients living in Toronto and all the nurses living in North Bay, or all the dental hygienists living in North Bay, right? Like you need to have that mix. And we're seeing, like Steve, that what you mentioned about the dentist, like that's how large parts of Silicon Valley work right now, right? That if you want to be a teacher, it's a teacher, like the schools are actually having to house the teachers. And that's a problem, right? It's it's hard to get workers, but then those workers are at particularly high risk, because now if you lose your job, you also lose your house, right? You also lose your housing. So I like the fact that people are trying to find these creative solutions, but I just look at it and go, okay, I think we need to think bigger, because I think a society where your housing is dependent on your job or on your employer, it's probably not a place we want to be in the long run.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how you unpack that a little bit further, just in terms of where we go from here, because I look at it and say, okay, well, the hygienist can't afford the condo. Okay, even if prices come down, they're going to come down maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. I think there's a lot of pressures still on housing from a supply side, immigration, things of that nature, and inability to build housing. So let's say the condo market comes off 10, 15%. I still don't think that's going to be affordable longer term. So, I think that deviates towards long-term rental housing, which we haven't been building. We're only now building. But I'm just curious if that's been a lot of your policy conversation. Everyone's saying, okay, listen, guys, like we have to admit that the days of a school teacher owning a detached house or a condo is going to be difficult, and they might just be long-term renters. That's unfortunate to say, but I think that's just the reality. And so how do we provide them adequate housing, long-term, stable, adequate housing?
Yeah, so that is a lot of the work that we do, and part of it is building more rental housing. I think that has to be part of the equation, but I also think it's just better long-term land use planning and better long-term transit planning, right? Because in some senses, really isn't new, right? That 40 years ago, you might have had somebody who lives in downtown Toronto, a middle-class job, and they want to have kids, so they move out to Etobicoke, right? 20 years ago, they might have moved out to a Mississauga or Brampton or so on. But the challenge is we can't really do that anymore. Like we're getting to the point where we push people out of that commuting distance. So I think we need to figure out, better land use ways that, people can live in I don't know, like a Richmond Hill or an Oshawa or something, and then be able to jump on transit and get to their job within 30 minutes. So it's this kind of holistic solution. Yeah, absolutely. We need more and better rental housing, but we've also need to find ways for those workers who, have to, like the dental hygienist who has to work on site. We got to find a way to get him or her to their job in a reasonable amount of time, noting that, yeah, it probably is impossible for everybody to live in downtown Toronto.
So I think it's obvious from the conversation that Mike hasn't been to Toronto for a long time, because the commute is horrible, right? It is pretty tough there, of course. I'm in Halifax, by the way, and we have, we also have commuting challenges for people who live off the peninsula. So what's interesting with the conversation right now is that everyone who is listening, everyone is probably nodding their head in agreement that we've known about these challenges now for quite some time. Mike, are we getting closer to, I don't see any solutions coming up really. And are you hearing it's more like, hey, now they're finally breaking the glass, break the glass when the emergency is that where we're at? Or is it still going to be, just policy decisions that get delayed and not a lot of execution takes place?
Yeah, I do think we are getting to a better place. I think of this as sort of a 12-step process, where step one is you have to admit you have a problem, and we didn't do that for a long time, or we didn't think that we had the problem that we thought we had, right? A year or two ago, maybe say 2 years ago, thinking was, well, it's an interest rate phenomenon, and when we get interest rate normalization, that will somehow make everything affordable again. And that's not to suggest interest rates don't play a huge role. They do. But, the thinking was, oh, that was the sort of sole cause of this. Or you get the short-term rental folks who go, oh, okay, well, if we just ban STRs everywhere, that will, that will clear everything up. And again, that's not to suggest there aren't STR problems in certain geographies, but that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue in my mind is just that disconnect between population growth and housing growth. And I think we are starting to address both sides of that equation, not as quickly as we need to, but we are seeing in Ontario, new policy statement that just came out recently. We've seen the federal government reduce things like or eliminate things like the AHST on purpose-built rental. And we're also attacking the population side. So we sort of recognize like, hey, maybe outsourcing our entire immigration system to a handful of Ontario colleges might not have been the best idea. So we
How dare you?
How dare? Well, it's funny, right? That 2 years ago we couldn't have had that conversation, right? It just would have been impossible. And now it's essentially become law of the land. Now, the Bank of Canada has questioned the federal government's commitment to, actually following through, but at least they're making those announcements now. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but we've also just dug ourselves such a large hole that even if we were doing everything right on policy, it's going to take a while to be able to fill that up.
So that's where I got to come in. So, I mean, you said you worked with Justin Trudeau in 2013 and 15. God love you for doing that. My question is, at that time, Canada still had some of the highest highest housing valuations. There's a website called demographia.com, and they do this annual report where they calculate house price to income, median house price to income, house price to rent for hundreds of different cities. It's an amazing theories. And at the top of this was Toronto and Vancouver. We knew at the time, immigration was centered in a couple of jurisdictions. Yeah. And then at the time, that's when a lot of the changes in immigration were taking place. In 2016, they changed, who was allowed to come and why, et cetera. And then on and on. Each year, it seemed like there was a new. So I'm trying to understand, or maybe you can help me understand the thought process that goes through the heads of people who know we have a housing crisis already, that roughly housing starts hasn't changed in 30 years, right? Clips along at 200, and then decides, what would really help tripling the population for our country. And so, can you just help me try to understand what makes a person think that way or compels that person to make those decisions?
Yeah, well, I think one of the mistakes that we can make in this area is to assume that there's some kind of grand plan behind all of this. And I think, that's one of the big challenges here. And that's not letting them off the hook. In fact, I would say that's the opposite, right? That this was just allowed to build organically. If you go back to the 2015 Liberal platform, like they clearly acknowledged there was a housing crisis. And one of the things that they had in there was removing the HST on purpose-built rental. That was a campaign promise back then that they decided for whatever reason not to follow through on. They did their housing strategy again in 2017. On the immigration or piece, the non-permanent resident piece, the federal government until recently had never had a target for non-permanent residents. They go, okay, it's just going to be what it's going to be. And I don't think they realized how transformative some of these changes would be. And some of those changes actually go back to 2014 under the previous government, like extending the post-graduation work permit program out to 3 years and things like that. I don't think they recognized how big those would be. And the one thing I will say about, and as somebody I worked inside the federal government in 2017, I think more at the civil service side than the political side, there is a real sensitivity, I would suggest an oversensitivity to not weigh into provincial matters. So there has been in the Ottawa bubble, again, until recently, this idea that, well, international students, that's a provincial issue. We're not going to touch that. Even though it's like, well, yeah, I suppose on one level it is, but at the end of the day, the federal government's the one signing the visas. So I think they were really kind of siloed in their thinking, kind of dividing the world into like, okay, here's the stuff we control, here's the stuff the provinces control, and let's, get out of that sandbox. I think that was a massive mistake. I would imagine, behind closed doors, these guys would probably say, yeah, we let this build for too long. But there was certainly, as far as I'm aware, there was never kind of any kind of grand plan to let the number of non-permanent residents rise to this level.
Sorry to interrupt the show. A quick message from our sponsors. Ever been lost abroad searching for Wi-Fi and all you found was frustration? Introducing Saily eSIM, the ultimate travel companion brought to you by Nord Security. With Saily, you can avoid outrageous roaming costs, compatible with both iOS and Android. Saily is so easy to set up. First, download the Saily app and install your eSIM with a simple tap. It's quick, easy, and hassle-free. Next, choose a plan that suits your travel itinerary, whether you're off to London, Mexico City, or visiting Rich's family in Portugal. Saily has a plan for over 150 countries, and with a variety of options, you can find the best rates that match your needs and the duration of your trip. Activate the eSIM before you travel and connect instantly when you land. No internet required. This ensures you're ready to go as soon as you arrive. With Saily, you stay connected wherever you are, cut those fees, and enjoy 24/7 chat support. No more waiting in airport lines or dealing with sketchy SIM card sellers. Just download once and you're good to go. So easy, even the boomer can do it. Go to Saily.com/LoonieHour and use the code LoonieHour to get an exclusive 15% off your first purchase. Link in the description below. And now, back to the show.
Now that we know that rental vacancies are at all-time lows, or as far as the data is 1988 low, we know that rental prices, despite Steve's misgivings about this, are still rising at 8.54% year on year. We know that house prices, even though there's been some pressure, have come down a little bit, but really haven't come off. I mean, is there a real commitment, do you think, to changing course? Or is this just a little bit of lip service because they're down in the polls? I mean, I'm just really trying to understand sort of where we're going to go from here. Because as far as I'm concerned, I think this problem is going to last for 10 years.
Yeah, I do as well. Even though, again, I would say that even if we did everything right, this problem would still last. Maybe not 10 years, but last a while. Yeah, I do think on the federal government, again, the commitment to reduce the number of non-permanent residents, I think is going to be a big thing because, that population is almost 100% renters. Right. So that the growth in that population is responsible not for all of our rent increases, but a significant amount. And I just want to be clear, because we're going to get hate about this, that I'm not blaming, some 18-year-old in Warsaw or Bangkok for screwing up Canada's housing policy, right? Like that's, it's not their job to make sure that our housing policy makes sense. It's the role of our governments. But yeah, I do think there is an understanding that they need to move. I think there's more that the federal government needs to do on the supply side. And one of the areas where I'm getting a little bit concerned is the advent from work from home is a very good thing, I think, and I'm doing this from my house now. And what we're seeing is this migration of younger working age people out of your Torontos and your Vancouvers and so on, going to a place like Edmonton or going, becoming Keith's neighbor and going to Halifax and so on. And I think we're going to start to see this, and we're already seeing this kind of rent compression where your big expensive cities, you're not seeing rents go up too much. But in historically less expensive cities, they're going up 10 to 15%, right? So it's not that everywhere's going up 8. Some places are no change and some places are 15%. But that's going to be a real challenge, again, for the kind of local renter who's not work from home. Because now if you're renting in a Halifax or a Moncton or wherever, you're now competing against people who are making Toronto and Vancouver wages, but working from home. Whereas you are earning lower local wages, but having to, compete with them on rents. So, on the one hand, yeah, it's nice to see this kind of migration, but I do worry about the sort of pricing out we're seeing of locals again in these secondary markets.
So to that point, how much conversation do you think there is internally in these big back rooms around immigration? Like, you just talked about. And I see it like, these young people that are not able to get into the housing market, not able to access the housing ladder without parental help. And so if you can't access the housing ladder, the chances are there's a good chance you might not want to start a family. If you're not starting a family and having kids, then, we're just going to have to immigrate even more people. And I think that just actually ends up creating these social frictions, which is, and we're seeing it now, right, with youth unemployment, which is being, it's the highest in 15 years because we just are importing all these temporary foreign workers that are basically taking. So I just kind of wonder, again, how much conversation is being had around, can we become a little bit less reliant on immigration, and can we actually try to find ways to boost Canadians to have children and to grow families?
Yeah, I think there is an acknowledgement that the housing crisis is contributing to a reduction in birth rates. And, there's a secular decline in birth rates everywhere, but some places are declining more than others. And one of those factors is home prices. And there's some very good research on that. On the population growth side, I would kind of divide it out into three buckets. So first is the international student bucket. Again, we know that there's a conversation there, that they've, changed that. I think the only question is, are they going to live up to those commitments? But they're at least, talking about it and making a commitment about it. The second, as you point out, is the sort of temporary foreign workers, other piece. The signals that we're getting in the newspaper are that they are going to move on that. I think the question is, how far, how fast. I suspect they're probably going to go farther than they've kind of indicated. And somebody, I've written about the TFW issue over the last few weeks. The response I've gotten that was probably the most positive of anything. I know, like, Steve, you've got your Substack and you see this as well. You write something, certain percentage of people love it, certain percentage of people hate it. That love-hate on the TFW issue has been overwhelming, right? It's like 95% are like, yeah, Mike, you're absolutely right. This is a huge issue. And I might get a couple little liberal partisans who are worried about it. So I got to imagine any kind of internal polling that they're doing or any kind of discussions are going to suggest, ratcheting that back. And then the third one is the permanent residency side of it, where we have, Canada's increased its target from 250,000 to 500,000. That's the one I'm not so sure about. That's the one where I don't know if there's internal discussions in the government or even the opposition of saying, hey, is 500,000 the right number? Should it be lower? Should it be based on some kind of formula that takes into account housing vacancies, things like that? Polyev has made some really vague musings about that, but that's the one where I think that could move, but I don't have a great sense of what that conversation's like behind closed doors.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't seen any party that's come out publicly and says we're going to lower the permanent residency target. So what about on that? Go ahead.
And I was going to say, and that would be transformative one way or another. And again, you do have to balance things, right? Like, we do have to understand that we have an aging population. We are going to have some structural issues. So, we need to grow things, but we have to make sure that, our immigration targets are aligned with our housing plans and so on.
But I challenge that aging population thing. I find that just it's got it backwards, because if you just subsidize, basically what you're doing by importing lots of cheap labor is you're subsidizing corporations effectively, and you're basically telling them that they don't have to make a decision between capex. They can substitute that extra marginal capex for cheap labor. And so as a function of that, they've been basically given the green light. They've been allowed to massively underinvest. If you underinvest, you don't improve your productivity. And if you don't improve your productivity, which is what ultimately matters, you don't improve the ability to pay for the things that these old people are going to need. And so I think we have it backwards. And there's a real lack of courage to take the second or third order thinking, which is, if we're getting older, then we need young people to pay for shit. But that's not true. If you're getting older, you need to be more productive. You need to, our gross fixed capital formation has collapsed virtually everywhere. If you look at business, and so machinery and equipment, structures, all this stuff. And so we don't invest in automation, robots. I mean, there's some countries that spend incredible amount of money on automating processes. We don't do that in Canada. Why? Because we import cheap labor to be cooks and stuff. And so, it's circular, but I think the arrows are pointing backwards. Does that sort of make sense to you?
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair comment, particularly with temporary foreign workers, right? That it's like, okay, do we need to, does Dairy Queen need to bring in all these TFWs, or maybe could we just invent a better ice cream machine? Like the one that gets me, there's this thing called LMIA Mapper, which maps out, which places are hiring temporary foreign workers. And the one that gets me, there's a Dairy Queen by Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, that is bringing in temporary foreign workers. I'm like, really? Like, you can't find some college students to work at Dairy Queen? Keeping in mind that enrollment in Fanshawe right now is through the roof, as is one of the schools that went really heavy on international students. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. On the immigration piece, I would, this kind of permanent residency piece, I would kind of divide out between, okay, yeah, are we bringing in some, lower wage workers versus, higher skilled and so on, or higher wage, right? And there does seem to be a shift over the last 20, 30 years. Like Mikhail Scudero and others have talked about this, that historically we've had our point system that really rewarded, workers
English.
with higher levels. Yeah, like with higher levels of higher education and so on. And we kind of watered that down recently. Now, in some areas, I think it might actually make sense to, like, we know for home building, like we have a shortage in some of the trades. It's like, okay, well, yeah, you've got an electrician who wants to come in who doesn't have a master's degree. I don't think we should worry about that too much, but it does seem like we've lost that strategic thinking in our immigration system, where we're going, okay, like what really are our needs over the next 20 to 30 years? And let's focus on that way, rather than going, okay, Dairy Queen's got a labor shortage today, so let's use the immigration system to deal with that, which I totally agree doesn't make any sense and really does reduce capital investment.
With that thinking, one of the my observations or critique, whatever you want to call it, with the current Canadian system, Mike, I don't think government has the opportunity to have that long-term mindset. I mean, especially today, what are we in 12 months away, 9, 10 months? I guess the election cycle might start at 6 months, really.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone is really invested in, trying to make these policy changes, to which I think Rich's point is spot on. I think too often today, people misunderstand that they're trying to treat the symptom of a disease instead of going back to what the actual disease is. And productivity, absolutely. That's one of the key challenges that not only Canada has to fix or at least address, but other Western world countries as well. And it's we're headed for a real struggle here coming up, and so it's something that I don't think I'm very I don't have a lot of confidence that this is going to be addressed in the next year because of the cycle.
Sorry, I just want to chime in there quickly. So you mentioned election cycles, which I think, Mike, this is kind of all ties in, which is, I think the BC government, the NDP government under David Eby, was actually, I think, very proactive, somewhat, in basically changing all the zoning. They basically effectively almost stripped municipalities from their zoning and said, listen, by way of right, every single family lot that's greater than 3,000 square feet in BC has to now allow duplex, triplex, fourplex, essentially. And then they created all of these transit-oriented areas that, if you're within, I think it's 400 meters of a SkyTrain station, you have to allow a minimum of 20-story towers. So they basically mandated that. Now we've got the provincial election coming up here in the next couple months, and the BC Conservatives are actually leading in the polls right now. And I think that Conservative leader, his stance is actually against a lot of the changes that the NDP government has just brought forth. In fact, I think he was saying, he believes the municipalities should have a lot more say. They understand their local needs and challenges more than the provincial government. And so, Keith, kind of to your point, it's like the unfortunate thing is you run in these 4-year election cycles, and everybody just kind of does and says what they need to in order to get reelected. And so, again, Mike, I'm kind of curious of how much of those conversations you have, how much kind of thought you put behind that in your policy discussions as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge problem, this kind of political whiplash, and it's part of the reason when we do the work that we do here. we try to make it cross-partisan. We sort of recognize that there's no value. Like, I could convince the federal government, to do X, Y, Z, but if that's not going to survive an election, there's no real point. It's not going to be robust enough. So, we're constantly trying to, get a buy-in across the spectrum and looking to do things like, again, remove the HST on purpose-built rentals. Was that necessarily, the most optimal policy? No, but it's one that we know is going to persist.
Why did
right?
it take them so long for that?
Well, they decided, the federal government decided to go another way. Like, they came out with the national housing strategy again and put money into public housing and that kind of thing. Why they thought they needed to have an or conversation instead of an and conversation, I don't really know, but eventually they did make good on their commitments to 2015, and that's likely to persist. I don't know if a Polyev government keeps the housing accelerator. I don't know if they keep some of these other things, but I'm pretty confident that they'll keep the HSTP. So that's what we're trying to look at. But I totally agree, and it's one of the issues, and I think it shows up in high prices and high rents that any policy area, I don't care if it's housing policy, manufacturing, or others, there's always a risk premium. And the risk premium based on political risk in Canada is really high for housing because we constantly seem to be changing the rules every couple of years.
So on the housing accelerator front, I'm sure you're involved in it in some capacity, but I actually thought it was generally like smart policy. Like, it made sense to me at face value. I think what we've started to see, at least with some of these municipalities, is they say, okay, yes, federal government, we are going to ease up our zoning. And then once they get the funds, they've turned around and basically jacked up their development charges and levies. I'll give you an example. City of Burnaby, which is the city where I mentioned to you earlier about the dentist. That was where his clinic was and where he's trying to go buy these condos. So they're having a housing crisis in Burnaby. Burnaby gets, I don't know what it was, I think it was like $50 million from the feds. They turn around and they put forth new legislation to raise their development charges. And it would effectively increase the development charges and fees, call it taxes, on new housing by $50,000 per unit. An additional $50,000 per unit of what they're already charging. And like, that's not an insignificant sum. And so I just thought it was like this great heist where it was like they were just taking money from the feds and then raising the fees and taxes to such a level where it actually makes, in this economic environment, it makes the housing unviable. You can't, the pro forma doesn't work for the developer now.
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem. And, one of the things that the federal government did in one of their infrastructure plans or infrastructure funds is require cities freeze development charges. The challenge is that they made that requirement only for municipalities of populations over 300,000. My understanding, Burnaby's about 250,000.
Yeah. I don't know the exact numbers.
So, but right. but it's under 300K, right? So, they put these rules in, but then they leave all these loopholes. One of the things that disappointed me about the housing accelerator, again, I like what they were doing on fourplex. I like a lot of it. I thought there should have also been stronger quantity targets where, not only do you have to do these things, but you also have to hit some kind of quantity target because it allows for, so many sort of ridiculous games, right? Where it's like, okay, we're going to legalize fourplexes, but every unit has to have its own parking spot. It's like, okay, well, that's not going to work on most lots, right? They did that a little bit. So basically the Housing Accelerator Fund comes in 4 tranches. So it's basically paid out a quarter. The final quarter on at least some of these do have a fairly modest housing target for each of these cities, but it's really not enough. And I think it shows the challenge of having a system that just mandates specific regulatory changes to municipalities. If a municipality really wants to slow development, they can find 101 other creative ways to do so and still stay within the letter of the law.
one of the challenges that I'm seeing, having these conversations fairly frequently with, developers, lenders of these projects, is that the economic environment that we're in today, higher interest rates, construction costs are still elevated, even though they're moderating. Pre-sale prices, right? I mean, you've seen Toronto new home sales 27-year lows, Vancouver 10-year lows. Like, if you can't hit your pre-construction sales targets, nothing gets built. And so I think all these policies are good and will probably set us up for the next sort of bull market where these numbers can start to pencil again. I don't think they do, and I think that despite what housing starts are showing you today, I still think they're going to be rolling over the next 24 months. I'm kind of curious what your conversations have been like that with any policymakers. I mean, one of the things that I hear frequently is like, so if you're a developer, you can't change what you already paid for the land. You can't change your cost of borrowing because that's what it is. That's what the banks are asking. And your tradespeople aren't going to take a whole much lower of a wage, and your commodities are already set in. So the only thing that you can change tomorrow is the government fee and taxes. And so I think there's a relatively reasonable argument to be made that temporarily, if you want housing start to continue to ramp higher and permits to ramp higher, the first thing you could do is you could cut development charges and fees, at least temporarily, until you kind of get out of this funk. But I don't think there's any appetite from any of these governments to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that a federal or provincial government could say, recognizing that we probably are going into a slump, and I absolutely agree, right? And I've seen your work on this and others where housing starts on condos basically lag pre-con sales by about 18 months, right? And just kind of follow line is like, okay, 2025 and at least part of 2026 looks like it's going to be bad. One of the things a higher order of government could do is say, you know what, we will pay 50%, 75%, 100% of the development charges if you get shovels in the ground in the next 2 or 3 years or something like that. Because you're absolutely right. It is the only part of this that can change. And yeah, I don't think the next 24 months are going to look that good. In Ontario and BC, we're not building that much ground oriented housing, at least not in Toronto and Vancouver. I don't see that changing much. Purpose built rental might do a little bit better, depending on where interest rates go. But I don't think those two things combined are going to offset just the bloodbath we're seeing right now in the condo market. So yeah, the next couple of years are going to be lousy unless something big happens. And yeah, I think we've got to figure out some way to go from that.
So we thought Mike was going to give everyone a ray of hope today. Clearly, that's not happening. No, but jokes aside, I think it is more of I think people will recognize that this is a sober, realistic conversation, and clearly, a single policy decision cannot change, a very complicated, sophisticated economy on a dime. We do have to take our lumps coming up. Another question for you, I don't know if it's appropriate enough, but you are close there in Ottawa. Who do people prefer more, Lenin or Marx?
I don't know. That's kind of old school, but yeah, no, I don't. Again, I think this is where one of the people get things confused, that the decisions that either on the political side or the bureaucratic side comes from some kind of grand plan or some kind of grand ideology. It's not like it's really just kind of stumbling around in the dark. Yeah, and just trying to sort. Yeah, well, that's just it. And again, that doesn't necessarily make it better. I'd say like, no, there is no plan here. But I think there is that sort of recognition that, hey, this is a big complicated system, and as well that events matter. And if you look at this government or any other government, I would say that most of what they end up doing happens in the first 12 months of any government, right? Because they've got their plan, they've got their platform, they got their ideas. And then, it's a famous British quote, like, events, dear boy, events, right? That you get all of a sudden, oh, okay, Trump's got elected in the US, or we've got a pandemic, or we've got this, or we've got that. And the focus shifts from whatever you had in your platform, whatever your grand idea is to have, to like, okay, we've got to just put out this current fire and current crisis. And again, that's not unique to this federal government. I think they're all that way. And I think, if we look at the provincial government here in Ontario, it's kind of the same thing where they had some ideas coming through and now they're just kind of scrambling, going, okay, how do we deal with this housing crisis?
I mean, I respect you, Dr. Mike, but man, I got to push back on. I mean, like, I just a little bit, because I mean, I'm looking at the monetary policy report from the Bank of Canada has a clear chart on it, and the chart you can look at it. We're going to share is chart 15 from April, and it shows basically the last 8 years, and it shows that housing starts versus demographic demand. And the problem I have is that we know there's like an endogenous factor, and then there's just like the reality. And so I agree with you, maybe there isn't a grand plan, but there was a clear and concerted effort to raise immigration in this country with no equal and opposite or paired decision or understanding or plan to raise housing capacity. And I think supply and demand, you raise prices. And I think that's where I respect your view, and I think you're right in a sense that there is no grand plan, but you can
screw things up pretty good, and I think that anyway, so that's I would agree, like, and again, I think you have to get kind of granular about the population growth. I think where you could be the most critical, or where folks could be the most critical in understanding, is that increase from 250,000 to 500,000 on the permanent resident side. That is clearly, like, they can't pin that on anybody else. They can't say, okay, well, this was Conestoga College and Kitchener causing this. It's 100% a federal decision. And if you go back and look at the sort of all the reports in immigration planning, they didn't really consider housing there. So that would be the one where I go, yeah, you know what? That's a fair comment. They chose to double the permanent residency target without really thinking of the housing thing. Some of the other ones, again, the sort of the college one, you're right. Get the Fed prop thing. So.
Yeah, you're right. They're not. I get that. I mean, the provincial jurisdiction, it does count for that. Can I ask you, just like not to switch gears, but I'm just saying, like, you've done such a good job sort of describing sort of what's been happening. What's something that you on the horizon that you think that we aren't necessarily talking about enough? I mean, maybe that's a way to turn it negative into a positive here.
Well, I actually think it's that long-term planning, right? Like, what does the next 30 years look like? Do we want to, let's put this in a Southern Ontario context, right? Are we thinking that most of the growth is going to be GTA and we're just going to build up the GTA? Or do we need other large centers? Is Owen Sound going to be the next Ottawa or things like that? We're not really, we're just trying to make it till Friday, and we're really not having that conversation. And I think the other conversation that we're not having enough is, I've finally, and others have finally, got governments to recognize that there is a disconnect between population growth and housing starts. They sort of recognize that. That's good. But right now they're in this kind of a unit is a unit mindset, right? That we're trying to hit 1.5 million, or CMHC's 5.8. But, to go to the point that Steve made earlier, they're not really thinking about the type of units and what that means for family formation and having kids, right? So if we get there by, building a bunch of studio condos in downtown locations, like, okay, yeah, we've hit a unit target, but it's not really going to help family formations, right? You just sort of recognize that there is a difference between having a 3 and 4 or 4 bedroom home of whatever type versus having a tiny studio condo. And we're really not having that conversation. We're treating all units as the same, and we're really not focusing on where the biggest deficits are. And that's in what I'd call family-sized housing, or housing appropriate for families with kids.
I think you're spot on. I mean, Ron Butler calls them dog crate condos. I think, like, in Vancouver, I see it so much, which is like, there's two options. It's either like, you're in a 2-bedroom. So if you're a family, you're either in a 2-bedroom condo, or you're coming up with an extra $1 million and you're going into a single family detached at 2.1 million. Like there's not really an in between, and we've just finally started to see some duplexes coming to market, and I can tell you those sell really, really well with these young families because they're relatively a little bit more, slightly more affordable, or obviously new construction. But I think the ground oriented thing is a huge thing. Yeah, I do kind of worry about just building like a city, a skyline of just straight towers and expecting Canadian families, which I don't think are used to that, right? I mean, I think
Hey, I have one
Well,
last
again,
question.
okay.
from a cultural perspective, I still think there's this idea that people still want like a front door and a backyard and a little fence.
God
and,
forbid.
Like, God, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's like, well, that's not who we are anymore. And like, I just don't think like people in Canada are prepared to be the next Hong Kong. But
Well, but even I'd even go further than that. Even if we could get people to think that way culturally, and go, well, we should be more like Europe or wherever. In Europe, there's a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom apartments,
Yeah.
right? And we're not building
Right.
those. So I said, okay, if that's the outcome you want, right, as policymakers, you want more families living in apartments, then you've got to change the building code. You've got to change development charges and things to allow for that outcome. I mean, we've basically, between the code and taxes, we've made it impossible to build these units that we claim we want. And I feel like policymakers too often try and have it sort of both ways, where it's like, okay, we want European style living standards and unit types, but we're not willing to have European style building codes. And I'm sorry, you've got to pick a lane here.
yeah, no, it's.
I have one more. I have one more question. I think you've been very generous with your time. But one last question here: Are there any conversations in Ottawa and in your circles of about a recession in Canada, the probability of it, and are they even envisioning what this might feel like and look like?
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of an ongoing thing. I think over the last couple of years, we actually thought there'd probably be one by now, and this leads into this discussion of a recession versus per capita recession and or things like that.
Cute.
But yeah, but overall, I think I do think there is a sort of recognition that when the Bank of Canada was raising interest rates, the whole idea was to slow the economy, and I think there was always that question of how low does that go, and do we overshoot or things like that. But yeah, no, I think there is thinking that might be a potential scenario where, again, we don't just have falling GDP per capita, but we have falling GDP. It's certainly possible, and I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing the Bank of Canada more aggressively cut rates than some other G7 global banks. That is on their radar.
So, Mike, just to wrap it up here, we appreciate your time, but is there any final parting words where, if you go to a policymaker next week and say, hey, this is what I think you should implement on the policy front. This is what I'd like to see. Is there anything in particular that stands out to you of things that you would change almost immediately?
Well, again, I think the number one thing that I think they're getting wrong is this unit is a unit mindset. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, policymakers are, I think, over focusing on, creating units that have below market rents. And there's nothing wrong with having but below market rents. But I think the challenge is that the market rent is too high, right? Not that we don't, have a certain percentage that are below that. So, I think that
you and I are on the same wavelength here. I think it's crazy. Everybody, the one thing that drives me absolutely nuts is that people go, none of this new housing is affordable. Look at it. It's come out and, they built this new rental building and they're charging, 1 bedroom in Vancouver. They're charging $3,000 a month. Why are we building it? It's so expensive. It's like, if you only unpack this developer's pro forma and realize that the cost of construction alone, like, it doesn't allow you to develop units below that cost. But I think what it does is, someone that has economic means will leave their older apartment building at $2,200 a month. They will leave it and they will go into the brand new one at $3,000 a foot or $3,000 a month. And it opens up the supply for for someone else.
Steve,
Yeah,
they don't
no,
believe
absolutely.
in demand. They don't believe in supply and demand curves. I mean, ultimately, that's if you built 100 McMansions, you know what I mean, you would devalue the price of the McMansion, and that's a really good point. I think it's so important. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That I do think filtering is important. They do miss that, and I think they just miss the impact this has a market around. I remember, this would be 12, 13 years ago. There was a proposal to build an apartment building in downtown London, Ontario, where I'm from, and it was 1-bedroom units for $950, and people go like, nobody can afford that. You know, they're like, we can't be building that. We should be building affordable housing, right? Now, affordable housing in London is $1,500. You know, so like if we had built more of those $950 units that weren't affordable, we might not have to build as many $1,500 affordable units. But you know, it's just that, you know, that kind of disconnect. That absolutely, I think we need to focus on the market side. But yeah, the big thing in my mind again is getting out of the unit is unit and focusing on housing for families. I don't think we're there yet. That's a message that we're trying to promote on the Missing Middle, our podcast, and other places, because that's I had to plug that.
No, of course.
Yeah, you beat me to
no. But yeah, no, that's our big message is focus on young people and families and get out of this unit as a unit mindset.
Awesome.
So my last question, just Mike, before we go, you know, you said you cut your teeth sort of in industrial policy.
Yep.
I mentioned problems with investment and productivity. What do you think is like the big barrier for Canada to sort of shift away, sort of to improve its industrial policy? I mean, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on technology, which I think is misplaced. Not enough emphasis on energy and commodities. What's your sort of prescription as far as how we can improve industrial policy? I know we're gonna have you back, I think, to sort of unpack that, but just, you know, as we wrap up.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of different areas. You know, we mentioned temporary foreign workers as one of them, right? That we never allow labor markets to go tight, right? And we know from evidence that St. Louis Federal Reserve just came out of a report about this, that tight labor markets lead to increased productivity and investment. So I think that's one. I think the you know, oligopolistic nature of a lot of our industries, you know, like Canada at some level is like 3 oligopolies in a trench coat, right? There's just not that much. There's not that you know, whether you're talking banks, airlines, what have you. So, and that's a combination of you know, international trade policy coupled with competition policy and so on. But I think at the end of it, it comes down to the need and willingness to innovate. The countries really only innovate when they have some kind of challenge, right? If you look across the planet, you know, the countries that are most innovative, it was, you know, the United States in the Cold War era, it's Israel, it's Finland, and so on. South Korea is another one, right? And they, you know, they have that challenge. We are very comfortable here in Canada, which is mostly a good thing. But it does cause us not to try and, you know, do the things that we need to do to become more innovative. So I think at times we're going to have to allow ourselves to be less comfortable. We're going to have to allow ourselves to go, you know what, some businesses are going to close because they're having labor shortages, and that's just the cost of having a productive economy. Or maybe we are going to have to let in a foreign airline to compete with Canada.
How
company.
dare you, sir? As
blasphemy. But that's going to be the cost of doing that. But we're just, you know, I think culturally and policy wise so afraid of having a little bit of discomfort that it never creates the conditions for us to have to be more productive.
Dr. Mike Moffatt, I think that's a great place to end it. Appreciate you coming on the show. We'll have to have you on again, but just to quickly plug you again. So you got a new podcast called The Missing Middle, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So we talk not just about housing, but basically the disappearance of the young urban middle class in Canada. So the problems, and we try and focus on the solutions as well. See how we can fix this thing.
Love it. And on Twitter or X at Mike P. Moffatt. Great follow, some dynamite threads there. So again, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Loonie Hour, and we'll hopefully have you on again here soon.
No, I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Thought that was a good interview from someone on the inside.
Well, he never did answer whether it was Lenin or Marx. I'm still don't know which one. I get in trouble for. I've actually had people inside Ottawa say, "You know, it's Keith, will you tone down that commie stuff?" But
Oh, it's just jokes, right? I mean,
Really?
come on. I thought it was just jokes.
is it? I
You
didn't
getting in
think
trouble?
it
You get
was.
you get some angry DMs.
Maybe it's you're getting too close to the mark, Keith. You're getting too close to the mark. Maybe that's why they're upset.
Yeah, that's what's happening. What do you have left, Steve? I know we used a lot of great time already. A couple more points to follow up today.
Just the rail strike in Canada. I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, Rich, you've probably got all the data on that, so maybe I'll let you take it away.
I mean, I have the data on how important the rail, how important freight is. I mean, and how much it costs and sort of the date and time. But I'm not really sure why they're striking. I mean, other than more money and better working conditions and stuff. But I think what's really interesting is there's basically two rail companies. There's CPKC, which is Canadian Pacific that bought Kansas City Rail. And then there's the other one. Maybe I'm screwing up the names. Sorry, CN. That's right. Yeah. And what's amazing is that they basically have railway that goes all the way from Mexico, so deep inside of Mexico, all the way through the United States, clearly, where there in the United States, there's 6 major railways, and then in Canada, there's 2 again. And so this is an incredible sort of and it has an incredible impact. So just quickly, roughly 30% of all. Sorry, go ahead.
I know you go ahead. I interrupted you. You're probably rattling off the numbers now.
Sorry, just quickly, just 30% of all freight, rail operations in Canada cross the northern border. So that's apparent according to the American Association of Railroads. 14% of all the bilateral trade is on rail. And what was really cool, I didn't realize, is that one day of disruption has like this ripple effect. And so it'll take like 3, 4, 5, 6 days to recover from the one day of disruption. So even if this only goes on for a week, 7 times 7, Keith, some Loonie Hour math.
49.
There you go. So that it could take, a month and a half. I think it could take a month and a half to fix it. It's sort of crazy. That's all I wanted.
So those rail lines, they carry about $1 billion Canadian dollars per day in trade.
Yeah, it's really wild. There's some beautiful maps and stuff. Anyway, Keith, I know you wanted to jump in there.
They also carry about 32,000 passengers a day. So people that are trying to commute to the office might be stuck.
A lot of stuff depends on the rail system, which runs on what for energy and power?
Mostly diesel, and so they're electric diesels. So they have diesel generators that charge batteries, and then they go.
Yeah, I haven't seen the air one yet. With the big sail up on it coming through.
So Moody's estimates that it'll cost the Canadian economy $340 million per day.
That's a lot.
So, yeah, I mean,
one of my favorite areas to go here in the city. I like to bike and stuff like that, but I go to the seaport all the time here in the city. It's a great place to go biking and stuff. So I love watching, the global shipping industry, from this hugely important international hub in Halifax. But just from a labor perspective, you get 2 sides. You have management, and then you have, the workers and the unions. So basically what happened, the contract is up. They've been negotiating. They couldn't agree. Finally, the union guys got locked out. So management locked them out this morning. So in theory, you're working the railroads, you show up for work today, and there's a lock on the door. You can't go to work. So management has locked them out. That's the way most of these contract negotiations work. One side either doesn't show up for work, or the other side locks out the other side. Because of the significance for the national economy as well, it's going to have an impact with Rich here as well, for the Americans in Mexico as well. At some point in time, government can legislate them back to work and then back to negotiation table. So usually it comes down to then. So this could last 1 day, 2 days, who knows? But ultimately, if there's no movement by union and management with negotiations, Ottawa has to step in and say, okay, lads, management, everyone, go back to work. We're going to get this figured out. And then there's always, of course, it depends who's in power at the time, who favors who and everything. But this can be very disruptive for the country from an economic perspective. And we'll see how long it lasts. I don't know if this turns into, a week or 2 weeks or just
could be
2 or 3
listening to
days.
this tomorrow. Could be over.
Yeah, it could be, or they could be legislated back to work. That's the key thing here. So again, it's very different than, the strike at, say the grocery store. Well, maybe that's not a good one, at the real
Strike
estate
at Ice
office
Cap.
or something. Yeah, we're not unionized. We're not down that road.
Not yet.
Anyway, not yet. There we go. Yeah.
So speaking of jobs, you had the U.S. labor market, huge revision, Keith. I don't know. What is it? What's the U.S. one called, Rich?
Non-farm payrolls.
BLS?
Oh, sorry, Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Man, they're like worse than StatsCan. The random number.
No.
Random number generator. Employment was so. The level of March 2024 employment is to be revised down 818,000 jobs, second largest downward adjustment ever recorded, only behind March of 2009, which was during the Great Recession. So almost 1 million people.
Wait, it's the third largest revision.
Well, I'm just telling you what
Anyways.
Twitter is telling me. It was the second largest.
Okay. All right.
So what's going on? How the hell did he miss that many people?
Well, do you want the I'll give you the generous interpretation, and Keith will put his tinfoil hat on and give you his interpretation of it. My interpretation of it is it's difficult to measure 150 odd million people working throughout 20 industries. This includes everything from people who might do childcare at a small daycare center to Tim Apple and all the people in Silicon Valley. And I think that when you're doing this as a statistician, I think you have major revisions, and these revisions often come in times of growth. And if you go back since 1980, there's been the average revision is quite significant. It's about 0.1%. But there's been in 1986 and 1987, there was a bunch of revisions of 4 and 5%. So that would have been, hundreds of thousands of people. In the 1991, there was a big revision. 2008 and 2009, there was big revisions. And so these revisions happen when you're doing seasonal adjustments over many, many industries, over hundreds of millions of people. And the idea that you have one right this second, I think, is just sort of part and parcel of trying to do something that's very complicated.
Do you think it happens, though, these
difficult.
major turning points where you get all of a sudden these massive revisions? I mean, there's been a very large divergence between the household survey and the labor force survey for 12 plus months, and everyone's like, well, what the hell's going on? Like, this households are saying one thing about their job position and situation, and the labor force is saying something else. And now it looks like the two are now coming closer and closer in alignment.
Yeah, there's one last thing. So I think it's often a lag. Those revisions are lagging, right? Because your model estimates, they don't actually go out and count 156 million people. They do this through payroll taxes. They do it through surveys. They do it through large companies, and they model it onto different companies. They have different jurisdiction that they then map onto bigger ones, and it's a very difficult thing to do. And again, generous interpretation. And so what I think you'd have is, like, when you have downturns, leading into downturns, you have the momentum of some of your previous contributors as far as the data wise. And when you have those downturns, that's when you get a bunch of these revisions. So to your point, Steve, maybe it is an indication that the market is actually much weaker than it otherwise should be because things are slowing.
I've always found that to be very fascinating, though, because obviously we're just using models and we're doing our best to model. But the fact that you have markets that are positioning, trillions and trillions of dollars based on this data, and you have a central bank, the Fed, that has a labor component to their policy setting, that's relying on this data, and they're like, oh, oops, looks like we overcounted by a mil. Like, it's just amazing that like we're setting policy and trillions of dollars on data that really is, I don't know, I'm not that great.
So I love the policy word "oops." That's a tough one. Uh, it it doesn't always find its way into the minutes. But without bungling up what happened with what I just heard then from you two turds, of course here. That wasn't very kind of me. So guys, so everyone listening, there's two surveys that the country does to calculate the jobs being created. One, they actually call someone's house and they say, hey, Steve, are you working? Yes or no? And Steve is working 3 jobs, a regular job, and he's doing an Uber, food delivery, and something else at the Gap in the week. Yeah, DoorDash, whatever. You say, yes, I am working, right? That counts as 1 job. And then there's the establishment survey, where I call all 3 of Steve's employers. How many people do you employ? And the number they tell me or report includes Steve. So what's happened here over the last year and a bit, whatever, the establishment survey, the non-farm payroll number we see, it's been inflated because, make it very simple, a lot of people are working more jobs. A lot of people are working more than 1 job, so it gets picked up that way. So that's why you get these big revisions.
That's like all those people though that are working from home now, and they work from home, and they have like 2. I think it's like a big TikTok thing. They basically work from home, and so they only work, instead of 40 hours a week at the office, they work like 25, and then they pick up another work from home office, and you basically have 2 work from home jobs.
Yeah, like for me, I report 2 jobs. I work for IceCap and the Loonie Hour, so I'm really stacking them up here in Canada. But for everyone just to appreciate it, as Rich is pointing out, it's complicated, right? There's millions of people working around. It's an extremely dynamic economy in the U.S. In addition, you have a lot of immigrants coming in to the country that are doing jobs that are not even documented. So how do you really measure the strength of the economy and everything? So you have that happening. The tinfoil hat, comment, I think that Rich mentioned, there is a narrative out there that some of the departments that are involved with calculating these numbers are trying to inflate the employment numbers to benefit one party over another. I don't buy that at all. I think that's just people writing stuff on the internet. And then the part about the Fed, they are very well aware of the difference in the 2 numbers. And I'd be surprised if they're just focused on the top line number and all of a sudden they're saying, oh, oops, we have to adjust our models. Cut. Yeah, cut. So, it does make for great headline stories here. At the same time, though, when you have to adjust the number of jobs down by 1 million, it ain't good. If they were adjusting it higher, it would be, oh, wow, the economy is ripping here, right? So obviously this is more on the downside than the upside, but just to give everyone, a bit of color with it, that's all. Again, yeah, there maybe not a lot of people were working as they once said, but it's not this, dramatic change. And then I think one thing that we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast was that the narrative now for markets, it should now be shifting, 99% away from inflation and central banks cutting rates to, there's a recession coming. Is it a deep recession, a shallow recession? Who's going to be hurt? Who won't be hurt? More rate cuts. And we're already seeing that in markets right now. So that's that's that part of it.
Yep.
There's just one last thing I just want for the nerds out there. If you just go onto the BLS website, there's a whole document called Comparing Employment from the BLS Household and Payroll Surveys, where they show you everything, the adjusted household numbers, what the difference are. There's even a little table that shows sort of the scope, the data source, outputs, reference periods, on and on and on. And it's really incredible. They really, these nerds really care about getting this right. So as Keith said, it's not good, but it's not.
That's
it's not
for you to
that
splice up
either.
in charts on Twitter. Go give Rich a follow. But I think that's a good place to put a wrap to it. We went a little bit over time here, but hopefully everyone enjoyed episode 150. If you enjoyed any of these episodes, enjoyed the Loonie Hour, all we ask that you share this episode with at least one friend or family member and allow us to continue to build the Loonie Hour community. And as always, see you next week.